This is the title. It was what I'm glad I didn't know sooner. Because there have been an awful lot of things that have been quite difficult about being parent of a child with autism, that if I'd known from the beginning, I might have sort of given up. And that would have been inappropriate because there have been also lots of really good things about being a parent of a child with autism. The future challenges I will come on to, and then I'll offer some concluding observations. So that's what, hopefully, the next half hour or so you'll get from me. Introducing Danny. This is how he was as a child. His father took that photo, and as you can see, he was a happy, smiley boy, very lovely. Obviously, I'm terribly, terribly biased, but I still love looking at that photo. He was diagnosed as having some form of communication difficulty and social difficulty just before he was 2. And just before he was 3, at a tertiary referral centre, he got the full assessment of autism and query global delay. And indeed, we knew really early on that Danny probably had fairly severe learning difficulties, that he wasn't going to be able to achieve huge amounts academically, and that he was probably going to need support and care for the rest of his life. I should also say about the family, some of you will know that Danny is the son of the writer Nick Hornby. And I'm saying that not to name drop, but because there are areas in which that is relevant, because I know that in talking about the experiences of the family, including the divorce, but in particular because Nick has been successful enough to make financial issues not a problem for us so far, that we are not representative as a family in the area of resources. And so people have sometimes said, well, it's all very well for them. And I'm very aware how lucky we have been in that respect. And I think it is very, very relevant to the issue of resourcing for reasons that might come clear later on. So that is why I say that. But Danny is Danny, and he doesn't know that he's got a famous father, and that's one of the great blessings of his level of impairment. This is a picture of Danny taken at school in the playground when he was about 7 years old. He went and still goes to Treehouse School, which I and some other parents were involved in setting up in the late 70s. Danny doesn't speak, although having said that, he does have a little bit of his own language. For example, do can mean hot. Please, will you put more hot water in the bath for me? It might also mean, you've put your coat on, that means you're going out, and I want you to take it off because I don't want you to go out. So, do is there. There's mama, he says, diddle for daddy. Another word that he has is kiki, and kiki can mean biscuit, and we asked Danny to explain. Danny, show me, and then he'll Makaton sign biscuit. It can also mean slinky, which is his absolutely favourite thing in the whole wide world, is a slinky toy. And the plastic ones he loves to break up, and the whole house can be covered with strands of coloured plastic. Unfortunately, he started to want to eat them, and we realised that this wasn't going to be awfully helpful for his gastrointestinal system. So we've now had to ration them somewhat. And the silver ones are great. You can't break them up, but then his hands get absolutely covered and filthy, and then he puts that in his mouth. So slinkies are now an ultimate reward for certain things rather than a sort of daily prop. Anyway, kiki. And he has the sign. If I don't know whether he wants a biscuit or a Slinky, I say, Danny, show me, and then he'll do the sign. He also has a communication book, which is a sort of development of PECs. Instead of having to take off a strip and form a sentence, he can do, just within the book, I want, and then flip through to the particular thing he wants. And it also allows more than I want. He can do descriptions like, Mummy is cleaning her teeth, or whatever. He does occasionally see me clean my teeth. This is Danny on his 13th birthday. Quite ambitiously, as I realised, only having booked it, we were on the London Eye. I booked a pod for Danny and his family, including his half-brothers, who were then toddlers, and some of his school friends who also had autism, and cousins, and some of his neurotypical friends. And there are two things to say about that trip. The first was, it only dawned on me as the pod was coming round that we all had to get on within a certain period of time, and that given the learning difficulties and the sensory issues and the fact that two of our group were little toddlers, that this was quite a challenge. And I suddenly thought, what happens? Because this pod will not slow down for anybody. What if the group gets separated? But anyway, we did all get on, and it was a terribly successful trip. And there's Danny sort of sitting on the rail with the Thames below him, looking every bit the teenager he had just become. He really enjoyed it. The other thing to say about that birthday was that one of the young men who came, two autistic, lovely chaps, two brothers. The older one was in his class, and we invited him because he'd only just come to the school, but it had been observed that Danny and he seemed to like each other, and I thought, I must invite him to Danny's birthday. It was the first invitation to a party this young man had ever had in his life, which felt terribly sad. He had been at an autism-specific school before, but there clearly hadn't been much cohesion, social cohesion amongst the families to organise social events. They're still really good friends. His friend has more speech than Danny, and often will talk about Danny at home. So what do I wish I'd known sooner? Someone told me that someone had told her when her child was diagnosed, there's no point in worrying, because all the things you think are going to happen won't happen, and you won't be able to anticipate all the things that do happen. So you'll be worrying about the wrong things anyway. And that's actually pretty true. There is really no point in worrying. Doesn't mean to say I don't. But I have learnt that she's absolutely right about that. There have been lots of surprises, and some of the fears haven't actually come to fruition. One of the things I was very worried about, and I think my own family background is part of this, if you're a Bovell, you are terrified of making a scene in public. So to have a child who makes very unusual noises in public, has no embarrassment at all, just is so utterly different from most of the people around him, in a totally joyful way. He'll rock, he'll flap, he makes a scene the whole darn time we're in public. So I have been cured of being a Bovell, which has been a really good thing. And other people don't mind, on the whole. People are, on the whole, kind. And an example of that, quite recently, one of the last times I took Danny out on my own to the local cafe, he seemed to be having a good day, so I thought I'll risk it. I used to go very regularly with him. He suddenly had a bad moment and screamed and actually lashed out at me. And I felt impelled to say to those who were in the cafe, I'm sorry. And there was a lovely woman who, once everything had calmed down, she said, you must never apologize for your child. I've seen him over the years and he is a charming young man and you never need to apologize. And she's right. She's absolutely right. And the warmth that came from all the customers in the cafe just reminded me people basically are on Danny's side. And that links to something else I wish I'd known sooner. Mike Fitzpatrick spoke yesterday very powerfully about the pressures on parents to hare around, to try and find all this myriad of cures, treatments, therapies, heaven knows what. Because in some ways we're being told that if you don't do something now, you are shortchanging your child's future. It is desperate and there's a terrible rush. And the media, yes, a lot was mentioned yesterday about the media coming up with the latest amazing thing, and people helpfully send you press cuttings. Have you seen this? And I sometimes pursued things because I didn't want to seem ungrateful to the person who'd sent me the cutting. And, you know, my priorities were a bit weird there because, you know, a lot of times I knew that this wasn't really going to be for Danny, but I just sort of felt I ought to show willing to thank people. One goes through all sorts of weird places early on in the journey. And I wish really, I did. I've always adored Danny and I've always enjoyed him, but I could have just relaxed a bit and enjoyed him even more, I think, in retrospect. And it's also not helped. And this is a professional audience, and I don't know, I think we still all need to discuss how to get it right. Because what I didn't want was someone to say, okay, your child's autistic, and hey, you're going to have a really great time. Even though it would have been true, because that's not what I could have heard at the time. I needed someone to say this is a very serious thing and life will be different. So I didn't want them to present it as a terrible tragedy, but nor would it have been right just to gloss over it and say, off you go then, it'll be fine. And I think that's at the heart of the dilemma of what has sometimes been called the treatment versus acceptance debate in autism. I have been so inspired and have learned so much from people like Anya, who has been absolutely wonderful meeting Anya, and her fellow autism rights activists who have absolutely rightly emphasised how pernicious it is, and Adam mentioned this yesterday, how pernicious it is to see autism as a tragedy and as a disease. That doesn't do anyone any services. It's an outrage and it's insulting to people with autism. Equally, there are some major challenges for people with autism and for their families. And if celebrating autism is seen as an excuse for not giving support, then that is a wild, unfair injustice as well. And how we get the balance here in terms of messaging is a challenge. But Danny's autism has not been a tragedy, and a book that there exists saying from tragedy to triumph that's doing terribly well in the US absolutely makes my blood boil, because no one's going to tell me that Danny's life is a tragedy. That's just outrageous. I've gone backwards. That wasn't the right thing to do. I've just realised there was something about fun and humour there. So much humour, so much humour. And it's not laughing at Danny, it's laughing with Danny. I love the fact that he's so disinhibited and doesn't get embarrassed and gets us all into such interesting situations. It's just fantastic. When he was 3 and there's a man sunbathing in the park, and for some reason Danny just went and lay down on top of him. Another time in the GP's surgery, when he saw this lovely looking middle-aged lady and beamed at her and walked towards her, and she was obviously enchanted, and I thought, oh, he's suddenly being terribly socially interested. And with great joy, he seized her glasses off her and started playing with them. And he'd actually obviously been really joyful about being able to play with her glasses, and it wasn't anything to do with her at all. She was a bit surprised, but again, she took it in her stride. So it's not only the humour to be had through Danny's lack of inhibition, and obviously we do have to teach him that you can get away with lying down on top of someone when you're 3, but oh boy. He hasn't done that recently, but I'm glad. But Danny's own sense of humour, and this isn't in the textbooks enough. I want there to be some research on the sense of humour of people with major intellectual impairments and autism who still have such a great sense of humour. When he was very little, one of the things he found hysterically funny was when Nick, when we were still a family unit, Nick rearranging the CDs on the shelves would just induce peals of laughter. And we knew that if we needed to cheer Danny up, all Nick had to do was sort of reach up and touch a CD, and off Danny would go in fits of laughter. So I have no idea what he thought was funny, but it was lovely for all of us because his laughter is so infectious. More recently, he's acquired a real cheeky, and I think socially imaginative sense of knowing when he's getting up to mischief and doing something that he knows he shouldn't be. And the expression on his face is absolutely joyous. He once, at break time at school, decided to hide in his locker because he didn't want to go out. And when he was found, he was just laughing. He knew that he was trying it on in a funny way. And of course, everybody found that very funny. Oh gosh, autism is so interesting. And Danny is so fascinating. And yes, there have been thousands of hours of listening and watching Pingu, Postman Pat, Thomas, Noddy and Sam. And there still are. And I don't care that they're not age appropriate, because as I said to a friend, what's age appropriate now he's 17? Pornography? Maybe I'm infantilizing Danny, or maybe I'm just allowing Danny to engage in his passions, but whatever. I do know I could do mastermind on Postman Pat. And the funny thing was, I've met a parent at a conference, and I said, do you think Miss Hubbard and Ted Glenn fancy each other? And she said, what, you mean the bit when Miss Hubbard says, thank you, Ted? and her autistic son obviously has the same passion about the same clip. So yes, it's very repetitive, but it has its own fascination. Danny learning to nod when he meant yes was such a key moment, because it was so liberating for him. No, he finds even more liberating. He's almost got to the point where whenever I say, Danny, shall we? He'll say no before I finish the sentence. But him learning to say yes and no were wonderful. And these are the sorts of milestones that I think if he were typically developing, I wouldn't have noticed. They would have just taken them for granted. And I don't think it's patronising. I just think it's that his being Danny gives us a whole new take on the miracle of human learning. I was terrified about adolescence. Danny and I lived on our own. Danny went to see his very lovely father and their family, and he was going 3 nights a week. He still goes 2 nights a week. But in many respects, I have felt like a single mother, albeit an enormously supported single mother. And I knew that when puberty came, and when Danny acquired physical strength superior to my own, we might be heading for awful things. I heard about a mother whose severely intellectually impaired autistic son couldn't be in the same room as her because he fancied her and was sexually inappropriate. I didn't know what was going to happen. But adolescence has been much better than my worst fears, because I've had fantastic support. And Danny, I will tell you a bit more. Danny himself has been amazing, and I respect him so much for it, and I admire him so much for it, but I've had an awful lot of support. And some of you will know that I have been involved in policy and campaigning. I have been described as strident, but support is everything. Support is absolutely everything. And it is testimony to all the policy and campaigning work that the NAS do, that other charities have done, that parents are doing, that professional allies to families are doing, and that autistic people themselves are doing. We have to go on. We have to go on, I believe, just saying how it is. And if that comes over as strident, then we need to maybe adjust how we deliver the message. But the messages need to get across. This is Danny literally having the right support. This was a 4-day residential trip. He goes to Treehouse, which is a day school, but they did a residential trip to Avon, Tyrrell. And it's the first time Danny had been away, had a night away from a parent in his life. And it was 4 nights, and it was 2 years ago. And he had a really good time. And that was an important eye-opener for me, because he's 17, and I know the umbilical cord will be stretched, and that I will probably die before him, and that there was what Nick described as 40 terrifying years when Danny is alive and his parents aren't, and that we are not helping him as parents if we don't enable him to get emotional independence from us. And that is another reason why support outside the home is so, so vital and crucial. This was Danny at the age of 14 in Las Vegas. Danny loves the Beatles, as do I. Danny also loves Cirque du Soleil. We took him to the Albert Hall in a box because we felt that was more sort of contained, and he might disturb other people around him less if he started rocking and things that he does when he's really happy and excited. And Cirque du Soleil, which is, some of you will know, it's a mixture of music, dance, gymnastics, the most extraordinary physical feats of circus performers. It doesn't involve language, so and it was perfect for Dan, and it was an amazing spectacle. So he'd gone to Cirque du Soleil in the Albert Hall, and then I heard on Radio 4 one morning that George Martin and his son, with the surviving Beatles cooperation, had done the Love production, but it was not going to tour. It was Beatles music and Cirque du Soleil performance, and it was going to be in Las Vegas, and it wasn't going to tour. And I thought, okay, we're going to get there, we're going to do this. And went with Danny's wonderful carer, Corey, who you'll hear more about, and Corey's partner. 4 of us went to Las Vegas, it took a lot of planning against a background of a lot of dissuasion, partly because we didn't know how Danny would be on a 10-hour flight, and that if he was unhappy, he would not make it the easiest of journey for his fellow travellers either. He absolutely loved it, and as one of we had asked for the right seat at the back so that if he rocked, he wouldn't knock the coffee off the seat of the person behind, which had happened on another flight before. We were at the back, we were near the loos, so all the people who were queuing up for the loo got to know Danny really well, and one of their fellow passengers said, "He's the happiest person on this plane, isn't he?" And when we got to the airport after 10 hours, Danny refused to undo the safety belt. He just wanted to go on being on the plane. Anyway, he loved Las Vegas. It was heaven, because Danny actually, especially at that stage of his life, unlike some of the textbooks, unlike the generalizations, and you know, the issue of heterogeneity is so important, Danny loved high arousal environments. None of this low arousal stuff for him. The best thing for Danny was all the casinos, not because he had any interest in gambling, not like Rain Man, couldn't work out any of the numbers. No, he just loved the lights and the slot machines. And he was in heaven. The other thing he loved was fairground rides. You do not get more high arousal, I think, than a noisy, in your face, in your ears, stomach-churning fairground. He would drag me up the road to the fairground, because I lived between 3 different parks, and there was one fair that used to sort of do the circuit of the park. So all summer, he would know where the fairground was. He has got a great talent for knowing location, where things are located that he's spotted, even if I hadn't spotted them. He can spot a fairground. And he loved Las Vegas. And this was an example of the fun and the joy and the surprise. If somebody had said, "You'll get Danny to Las Vegas and you'll have a lovely time," I would have thought, no, that's someone else's life. But he loved it, and really, really glad we went. This conference has talked about what an exciting time this is for autism. There's so much to learn, but even in the years that I've been involved in autism, what is taken as accepted knowledge has moved on hugely, hugely. Things like sensory issues were not part of the textbooks in 1996 when Danny's diagnosis came through, for example. This thing of trusting oneself, I mentioned sort of following through some weird and wonderful suggestions, almost because I felt I had to be grateful to the people who'd made them. If I'd just stuck to my instincts more, I would have saved a lot of time, I think, and got on, as I had mentioned before, enjoying Danny. But also, and this is the area of controversy really, there are some aspects of everyday life and some things that parents and people with autism themselves know that are ahead of the textbooks. And that's inevitable, isn't it? Because science has to form hypotheses based on some observations, and where are the observations going to come from? I would love for more of the hypotheses to be formed with a collaboration of families, because I think there are some great insights. When we were setting up Treehouse, one of the insights we had that the local authorities around us didn't was that autism was far more prevalent than they thought. I mean, we were still reading about 4 or 5 per 10,000. But I just knew from the locality, I knew that in the next door road there was a child Danny's age with autism, and then the road beyond that there was another one, and I hadn't heard about the Islington cluster, because there isn't an Islington cluster. We were just representative of the 1% that has now become the established prevalence rate. So when we went to the local authorities and say, you haven't got enough autism-specific places, and what are you going to do about all these autistic children? And they said, oh, well, yeah, there is one autism-specific school in Islington, and that will serve the needs of Islington and the surrounding boroughs. And I don't mean I told you so. I don't mean to sound smug, but we did know better. And Treehouse has expanded faster than our business plan. There are very many children with autism. Mercifully, not all need a provision like Treehouse, which is highly intensive. And we all know about the breadth of the spectrum, and of course there needs to be a spectrum, therefore, of educational and other provision, from mainstream with support through to highly specialised provisions, and using different approaches and different methodologies for the diverse learning needs of the broad population. But this is where I feel we as parents, we knew this, and we were thinking about it daily, hourly, in a way that at the time, local authority education departments, not all of them were. So we were, in some respects, ahead of the textbooks in that area. But boy, we certainly need you experts and you professionals in so many other areas, which I will talk about in a minute.
5 minutes, Virginia.
Thank you. I've just talked about knowledge being diverse and many-layered, and sometimes formal knowledge follows informal experience, but it's all aspects of knowledge. Belying the textbooks, Danny is really good at relationships. This is a friend of his at Treehouse. They don't speak. Sometimes they ignore each other completely. Sometimes they get really angry with each other because at the moment, both are sound sensitive and very noisy. So there's this sort of major incompatibility at times. But look at that eye contact. This is the bit I've had to insert when I realised the title of the talk didn't cover some of the things I need to say. Yes, life has been restricted. Haven't been away for longer than 4 days on my own, or 4 days with Danny, since Danny was born. If I go away with Danny, I have to pay someone to come with us because I can't handle his challenging behaviour on my own. And also, oh, it's on the next bit. I was going to talk about sleep. I'm often too tired to deal with him 24/7 because, as Wendy said yesterday about her own sleep needs, 4 hours a night, Danny doesn't need much sleep. Unfortunately, I do. Popping down the road when I've run out of milk, if I'm on my own with Danny, it's not really safe to leave him on his own in the house, and I don't always get my milk ordering right. They're just silly things that some mothers of a 17-year-old don't have to think about, which I still do. Yes, I can't leave him on his own. Danny does self-injure, and he doesn't know what's dangerous and what isn't. Even when we're having lovely times, there's always a sort of what's around the corner. When he was very little, we went to a soft play centre, and I thought this is one thing which he will enjoy, where he's safe, and I can let him go off on his own, which is really important, that he can do his own thing. And all the other mums were sitting, chatting to each other, having coffee, completely oblivious of their children, because they knew their kids would be all right. But I was watching him like a hawk. And I had to, because at one point he was sitting at the top of a slide, really happy, but with a long, long, long queue of children behind him, trying to persuade him to go down the slide. And he wouldn't. And I had to sort of enter the soft play area and sort of drag him down. And as I arrived, I heard one sweet little boy said, "I said, what's your name?" And of course, you know, this was, Danny wasn't aware of that. So even in a soft play area, you're always on the lookout. And that never changes. I've mentioned sleep. Danny's autism has not caused him to suffer. But Danny is not well. And this is the bit that I'm going to find the hardest to say. When I told Nick that I had agreed to do this, I said, "How much should we talk about Danny's illness?" And he said, "With an NAS audience, you must tell them everything, or not do it at all. Be as honest as you can bear to be." Danny's gut problem is the worst thing that's ever happened to him, and it's the worst thing that's ever happened to me. Oh, I won't talk about SEN just yet. He has dysmotility of the gut, which means it's his life's work to get food out the other end, having processed it. It causes him terrible pain. When we first realised that he really was in pain and not just being autistic when he was crying, because one doctor said, well, autistic children cry a lot. We did have to push, because there was an atmosphere of scepticism. And one of the requests I have of a professional audience is, please never dismiss an unusual symptom. Please always take families seriously. When finally there was a test and the gastroenterologist said, these tests' results are grossly abnormal, I said, could you repeat that, please? Because I was almost braced for sense, yet again, this is a pain. He holds up the tube. It's happening because it makes him feel so much better. And he pushes down the syringe. And I respect him so much for having learnt that this is a good thing. And, you know, he puts up with stuff that people with twice his intellectual capacity would balk at. I'm being flashed. I'm glad I didn't know how fraught areas of SEN, disability, and autism would be in terms of the struggles that families would have sometimes to get their children's needs recognised and met. I don't want to blame anyone, because one of the things I've learned is that most of the things that are causing the relationships are structural. They're not about goodies and baddies. What's so sad is when structural impediments lead to entrenched positions. One example, and I know I've got the amber on, just the one example. Danny went to a really excellent local SLD school. And they were wonderful, and I was allowed to go in and observe, and I saw another child with autism who was making huge progress. It was a really good school. Danny didn't progress there. He started a home-based ABA program, and for Danny, at that time, it was like the light came on. Gina Davis's talk, which I couldn't go to yesterday, I love the word joy. Danny started learning joyfully. And the educational psychologist observed Danny in both settings, and she said to me, I can see what you mean. Danny's a different child on the home program, but obviously I won't be able to say that in my report. And I knew where she was, I understood. I clucked and I said, no, I quite understand. This is me, the militant. And when it came to my own child, I did understand. She and the authority were worried about the floodgates, or they worried about, I don't know what. But I didn't question it. And I look back on the report just before this speech, and it just says, Danny is reportedly much more interactive on the home program. I don't blame her. There's a limited budget. I've just mentioned that this particular school was doing brilliant things for another child. And I'm aware that Treehouse itself has not been the right school for every single of its pupils. Because I've also heard from hundreds, thousands of parents all over the country, I'll hear one provision being both praised and vilified by different parents. And I've learned how humble we should all be and how much we all have to learn. What I hope is that we all learn more to take at face value what people are bringing to us as families and not just judge provisions, judge treatments, judge methods just through rumour. Debbie's story, some of you knew. She died being too frightened to go to the doctor about her own symptoms because she had been accused of fabricating the illness of her children. She was on the spectrum. She fought for the right educational provision for the children. She did it in a non-neurotypical way, was labelled as attention-seeking. She was totally misunderstood by the professionals around her, and most of that was based on rumour. We all want this for our children. I've just been at Steve Broach's excellent talk about the legal issues, and it's very, very frightening what's happening with cutbacks.
Virginia, can you make this your last comment?
Yeah. I'm trying to move forward. The green button is not responding. Is that because I'm not allowed to make another comment? My slide said I love the NHS and I love public funded services. If Hans Asperger can go on progressing the science for people with autism during Nazi Germany, we can all go on progressing the interests of people with autism even through the cutbacks. Parents and families need you professionals to hang on in there and be stroppy if you can when you need to be. We really, really need you to hang on in there. And thank you. Thank you for all you do.